Continuing from our discussion of the historical background of medieval philosophy, we now delve into a pivotal moment, the intellectual explosion fueled by translation. Imagine a massive, well-funded project. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a global knowledge acquisition drive. Starting around the late 12th century, scholars, often backed by powerful patrons, whether popes or kings, were feverishly translating works, first from Arabic, then increasingly directly from Greek. It wasn't just any texts, they were diving deep into Aristotle's entire intellectual universe, the Organon, his logical toolkit, followed by his take on everything from physics to politics. This wasn't a slow trickle, it was an intensive immersion program for the academic world. So, what did all this translated Aristotle actually mean for how people thought about knowledge? It introduced a new blueprint, a paradigm shift. The big idea was Aristotle's concept of episteme, or scientia in Latin basically, the highest form of certain demonstrative knowledge. Think of it as the gold standard for understanding. The goal became incredibly systematic. For any subject you wanted to study, say, theology or natural philosophy, you first had to pinpoint those fundamental principles, the bedrock truths that were self-evident. Then, from these axioms, you'd build everything else through rigorous deduction. It's like building a skyscraper. You need unshakable foundations and precise blueprints. Where was the secret sauce for this method? Buried in Aristotle's Posterior Analytics. John of Salisbury, a brilliant mind of the 12th century, knew this treatise was key for mastering the art of demonstration, the most demanding kind of reasoning. But he also admitted it was tough stuff, extremely subtle, and only a few could really get their heads around it back then. It took until the early 13th century, with thinkers like Robert Grosseteste, for this complex text to finally get its proper commentary and interpretation. Once Grosseteste cracked the code on the Posterior Analytics, things really took off. Suddenly, everyone wanted to be scientific. Scholars across different fields started trying to mold their own work according to this Aristotelian ideal. And get this, even theology jumped on the bandwagon. For a while, at least until the mid-14th century, theologians were trying to frame their arguments as scientific too. Now hold on a second, isn't theology based on faith, on revelation from God? How can its starting points be self-evident like mathematical axioms? That was a tricky problem, a bit like trying to square the circle. But the ambition was there, to create a body of knowledge so solid, so logically sound, that even non-Christians couldn't help but agree. So when medieval thinkers talked about science, they weren't just talking about physics or math as we know them today. Their definition was way broader, encompassing any systematic, rational inquiry aiming for that highest level of certainty. Now it's important not to think of this Aristotelian takeover as a simple, clean replacement of old ideas. It was more like a remix. Much of this Aristotelian content and structure got absorbed into existing intellectual frameworks, many of which had strong Neoplatonic roots. Think of Neoplatonism as having this grand hierarchy of reality, with the spiritual and immaterial realms at the top, and the physical world below, ultimately destined to merge back into the divine. This view often clashed with Aristotle's emphasis on the material world and empirical observation. So while Aristotle was hugely influential, he wasn't always the whole story. There were sharp critics even during his peak popularity. Thinkers like Bonaventure and Peter John Olivi pushed back against aspects of Aristotelian thought, especially when it seemed to contradict Christian doctrine. The takeaway? What we call Aristotelianism in the Middle Ages was never monolithic. It was a dynamic blend, constantly negotiated, debated, and adapted within a wider philosophical landscape. So how did this all play out in theology? The big push was to create a kind of universal knowledge, a rational system so compelling that even pagans might have to nod along. This led to theologians doing a lot of what we'd now call philosophy. Thinkers like Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, Henry of Ghent, Godfrey of Fontaines, they were the rock stars of this era, all trained in logic and philosophy. They made a crucial distinction. Philosophy was about using reason on evidence you could naturally observe or deduce, whereas revelation came straight from God. But here's the twist. They didn't see these as separate boxes. They believed philosophy was essential for religion. If Christianity was going to be taken seriously intellectually, theologians had to understand all that human reason could discover. Philosophy wasn't just a tool, it was described as theology's handmaiden, the ancilla theologiae. Interestingly, the more philosophy maintained its own integrity and independence, the better it served theology. This means their deep philosophical explorations, even if framed within a religious context, often hold up remarkably well to modern secular scrutiny. But not everyone was convinced that philosophy needed the handmaiden's apron strings tied to theology. Some scholars, particularly in the arts faculties at places like Paris, started thinking bigger. Figures like Siger of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia argued that philosophy by itself could lead to the ultimate truth. They envisioned a philosophical life, a pursuit of wisdom, that could stand completely outside religious institutions. Think about that. A return to something like what pagan philosophers used to do, competing with Christians who also called themselves philosophers. Their idea was that pure, unadulterated natural reason was the key. Unlike earlier Christian thinkers like Origen or Augustine, who found Christian contemplation by channeling Platonic ideas, these guys thought that bringing faith or church doctrines into the picture would actually hinder the quest for truth. Here, the lines blurred, and sometimes the distinction between philosophy and theology flipped. Philosophy became the master, and religious thought potentially subordinate, maybe even overshadowed. Naturally, this radical stance caused waves. You can imagine the conservative theologians getting nervous. Even in supposedly enlightened universities focused on science, there was pushback. As early as 1210 and 1215, authorities in Paris were already banning public lectures on Aristotle's natural philosophy and key Arabic works, likely Ibn Sina's. These restrictions eased a bit later as Aristotle became part of the standard curriculum. But then, in the late 1260s and early 1270s, the perceived link between pure reason and wisdom really spooked the establishment. In 1270 and again, more comprehensively in 1277, the Bishop of Paris officially condemned a whole list of philosophical propositions. Many of these were purely philosophical ideas, but the conservative masters saw them as dangerous threats to Christian faith. Even Thomas Aquinas got indirectly implicated. Similar condemnations happened in Canterbury. Did these bans actually stop the ideas? Scholars debate that now. By the mid-14th century, many felt free to discuss these very ideas again. The lesson? Studying religion and philosophy together was always going to be a potentially explosive mix. This tension wasn't just confined to university walls. Out in the wider world, especially among literate and semi-literate lay communities in the Rhineland, a similar, perhaps even more unsettling, tug-of-war was brewing. Thinkers like Ulrich of Strasbourg, Dietrich of Freiburg, and the famous Meister Eckhart saw the call to use reason differently. They didn't see reason as a rival to faith, but as a path towards it. Following reason deep into the soul, they argued, could lead directly to discovering the truth of revelation, bypassing the need for official church approval. They looked back to Neoplatonic traditions, figures like Pseudo-Dionysius and the pagan philosophers Plotinus and Proclus, to promote a program of personal mental enlightenment as the way to encounter God. What made this movement particularly potent was its connection to the common people. Especially Eckhart, who ministered to non-clerical folks, gave these ideas a resonance far beyond the ivory towers. We start seeing a fascinating cross-pollination between learned and popular thought, a kind of philosophizing attitude taking root among ordinary people. And intriguingly, it was often communities of laywomen, the Beguines, who were most receptive to this mystical, reason-driven spirituality. Moving into the 14th century, the intellectual landscape shifts again. While some lament the end of the 13th century as the peak, recent scholarship, especially from those attuned to modern logic, finds a lot to admire here. The new approach, often called the Via Moderna, built on the logical groundwork laid earlier by thinkers like Abelard. It took propositional and terminus logic and ran with it, applying logical techniques to various fields. William of Ockham, the brilliant Oxford Franciscan, is often seen as the figurehead of this movement, partly because of his famous razor principle, though his specific view on universal's nominalism is probably better termed conceptualism, is just one piece of the puzzle. What defines the Via Moderna? A massive focus on logical puzzles, especially those involving self-reference, and games called obligations, where the goal was to trap opponents in contradictions. This intense focus on language, meaning, and logical structure makes their work feel surprisingly at home in 20th century analytic philosophy. At the same time, there was a surge in analyzing quantity and experimenting with quantitative reasoning across disciplines. Think of the Oxford calculators. Some historians even see the seeds of the scientific revolution in the work of thinkers like Buridan and Nicole Oresme from this period. This heightened logical acuity had consequences. It bred skepticism. People started questioning the bedrock certainty of the grand systems built in the previous century, including academic theology. Was it still the pinnacle of wisdom? Or was faith becoming less dependent on elaborate philosophical justifications, the kind Thomas Aquinas provided? In some cases, analyzing how we think and act seemed to replace metaphysical speculation about the nature of reality. Meanwhile, politically, the Middle Ages were hitting their bitter end. The power struggles between popes and kings that simmered throughout the 12th and 13th centuries erupted into open conflict. Innocent III flexed papal muscle, intervening decisively, even calling crusades against emperors. But by the late 13th century, kings like Philip IV of France were flexing their own muscles, challenging papal authority. The arrest and humiliation of Boniface VIII in 1303 was a watershed moment, proving lay rulers held the real power. For nearly 75 years, the papacy was effectively held hostage in Avignon, the infamous Babylonian captivity. All this political turmoil spurred intense theoretical debate. Defenders arose for both papal and lay power. Thinkers like Giles of Rome and James of Viterbo proposed a balanced dualism hierarchy. John of Paris offered a more realistic view of separation of powers, and Marsilius of Padua penned the radical defender of peace, denouncing papal claims to temporal power. On the other side, Augustine of Ancona defended papal authority. William of Ockham, our man of the Via Moderna, was central to this political debate too. He famously challenged Pope John XXII over the Franciscan vow of absolute poverty, writing extensive dialogues on heresy. He argued for the normal independence of church and state, allowing for exceptions. But let's not overstate the radicalism of figures like Occam or Marsilius. Ideas supporting individual conscience and natural rights, even resistance to rulers, existed before them. Thinkers drawing on Aquinas and Aristotle's politics were already interested in mixed governments. When you combine these earlier ideas with the theories of sovereignty from the Hierocrats, plus the critiques from Marsilius and Occam, you get the messy, fascinating beginnings of modern European political thought. Other changes were brewing. John Wycliffe, reacting against decades of nominalism, brought realism roaring back. Politically, he advocated for disendowing the church, gaining some traction in England. Elsewhere, scholasticism itself began to lose its grip. In England, law took precedence over theology. And in Italy, a new air was stirring humanism, consciously rejecting scholasticism. Yet even Petrarch, the father of Renaissance humanism, took Augustine's Confessions up Mount Ventoux. The scholastic tradition, especially Aquinas, even survived, experiencing a revival in the 16th century. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider the role of authority in medieval thought. For most Jewish, Christian, and Muslim thinkers, philosophy operated within a framework where belief in specific texts, the Bible or Quran, as divinely inspired was paramount. Thinkers did provide arguments for accepting these texts, but once accepted, their authority was considered absolute, transcending human reason. Scripture wasn't something to be critically examined like a scientific hypothesis. It was the reliable source of truth, especially about God. It provided the data, the pre-theoretical commitments, upon which further reasoning was built. Now, this might sound like blind faith, but it's worth noting two things. First, authority plays a role in all thinking. Even Descartes didn't try to prove everything from scratch. We all rely on experts today. Second, medieval reliance on Scripture actually spurred thought. Because Scripture was seen as infallible, interpreting it correctly became a massive intellectual challenge. How do you reconcile passages that seem contradictory? This led to sophisticated hermeneutics, like the fourfold sense of Scripture, literal, allegorical, moral, anagogical, creating flexibility. Below Scripture, the Church Fathers, the doctors, then the church hierarchy, especially the Pope and councils, and finally renowned theologians like Aquinas and Bonaventure, formed a hierarchy of authority, culminating in the respect given to classical philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Finally, let's look at where all this philosophical action actually happened in writing. Forget journal articles. Medieval philosophers wrote in diverse genres. You had meditative works like Augustine's Confessions or Boethius's Consolation, blending spirituality with deep thought. There were theological treatises tackling doctrine, like Augustine's On the Trinity or Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. Commentaries on classical texts, especially Aristotle, became huge, with figures like Ibn Rushd and Aquinas producing massive expositions. Compendiums and summaries, like Peter of Spain's Summulae Logicales, were essential textbooks. And then there's the quintessential scholastic genre, the question or quaestio. This arose from classroom debates and became the standard format for publishing ideas. Think of Abelard's Sic and Non, collections of questions from courses linked to texts like Lombard's Sentences, or the famous general debates, Quaestiones Quodlibetales, where masters tackled any question thrown at them. Even Aquinas's monumental Summa Theologiae is essentially a collection of questions. Beyond these, you find natural philosophy, works, letters, sermons, and polemics, especially driven by political conflicts. It's a rich tapestry of intellectual expression. So, wrapping up this whirlwind tour through the later Middle Ages, we see a period far from static. It was a time of incredible dynamism, marked by the absorption and transformation of Aristotelian thought, the rise of the scholastic method, intense debates about authority, the complex dance between theology and philosophy, the emergence of mysticism reaching the masses, and the very seeds of modernity being sown. It was a complex, often contradictory, but undeniably foundational era for Western thought.